British Columbia is world-renowned for its natural beauty, diverse communities, and thriving culture. It's also known for being in the grips of a housing affordability crisis decades in the making, which has been compounded by a poison drug crisis and by the COVID-19 pandemic. The province has an ambitious plan to address the crisis through the largest investment in housing affordability in BC's history. Tasked with building tens of thousands of homes in hundreds of communities is BC Housing, the province's agency responsible for developing, managing, and administering a wide range of subsidized housing and homelessness services across the province. BC Housing doesn't do this alone. To address the challenge, they're working with hundreds of partners. In this podcast, you'll get to hear from those delivering innovative and exciting affordable housing solutions. I'm Sara from BC Housing, and this is Let's Talk Housing. In today's episode, we'll be talking about the provincial government's ambitious plan to build the homes people need through the largest investment in housing affordability in BC's history. We have a very special guest today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are recording this entire podcast on the ancestral homelands of hundreds of Indigenous peoples and nations across British Columbia, each with their own unique traditions and history. Today, I am on the ancestral and unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, who have been the caretakers of these lands for thousands of years. We offer respect to their peoples, past and present. Also, in full transparency, we are recording this episode in October of 2021, and it reflects the issues at that time. Joining us today on Let's Talk Housing is the Attorney General and Minister responsible for housing, David Eby. David Eby was elected as the MLA for Vancouver Point Grey in 2013 and re-elected in 2017 and 2020. He is an award-winning lawyer noted for his work on constitutional and administrative law issues related to the protection and promotion of human rights and democratic freedoms. His experience with housing began well before his current stint as minister responsible and includes work with the Pivot Legal Society to protect the human rights and dignity of homeless and underhoused residents of Vancouver's downtown east side that was recognized with awards from the UN Association in Canada and the BC Human Rights Coalition. David Eby is also co-host of The Dash, a podcast about life and politics in British Columbia. Minister, thank you for joining Let's Talk Housing.
Well, thanks for having me, Sara. Hello.
So let's get started, Minister. This is your third term as an MLA, as I mentioned, and your second term as the Attorney General. It was just about a year ago, as we're recording this now, that you took on the responsibility as well for housing. How did you react when the Premier asked you to take on housing?
Well, I think it's probably obvious to any of your listeners that know my background. I was totally thrilled when Premier Horgan asked me to take on the housing file. Before I was asked to take on housing, I was working on, in addition to the Attorney General files, I was working on ICBC and gambling and liquor. And those files went to the Public Safety Minister, and I got housing instead. And so, the car insurance file was really important, and I'm very proud of the work our government did on that file. But compared to housing, the impact and the day-to-day perspective of British Columbians on that issue and their interest in it and their ideas about it, it's just a very different kind of file, and I'm really enjoying it.
That's fantastic. You're really enjoying it, and it's also very, very complex, as listeners to this podcast will know by now. You've made great strides when you're in, but it's a complicated issue. What are the issues that keep you up at night?
Yeah, we haven't solved it yet, Sara, but we're working on it. The fine people at BC Housing and the Ministry of Attorney General and Housing, we're doing our best to make a difference. It is a wicked problem. It is an incredibly complex and challenging issue. There are so many feeders into the crisis that we have right now in British Columbia around housing, and it's different regionally. So, when you ask what keeps you up at night, there are a few different things. Okay, so first is just generally the availability of housing for people and families who are out working in their communities. And it's different in the south and the north and urban areas and rural areas. So in rural areas in the north, in the interior, seeing things like just an absence of developers or shortage and challenges around labor and materials, where it makes it really difficult to get any housing built at all. And then in the largest metropolitan areas of the province, the Capital Regional District in Victoria, the City of Vancouver and Metro Vancouver, there are lots of developers, there's lots of interest in building, and there's the labor and the materials, but getting through the processes around the zoning to be able to build the housing that we need, that we know we're going to need, is a huge issue. So just that is one thing that keeps me awake at night. Like just the City of Vancouver, we know that Amazon is coming. We know that they're bringing more than 10,000 employees along with them. We know that the federal government's increasing immigration dramatically, and that about 20% of the new arrivals to Canada will end up in Metro Vancouver. So we know, even without interprovincial migration from Alberta, that we're seeing a lot of people coming to Metro Vancouver, and our housing supply is not keeping up. So that's one thing that keeps me up, because it results in displacement, it results in eviction, and it results in homelessness. And then that's the second part that keeps me up is the growth in homelessness. During the pandemic, a lot of people were looking around for homes that were bigger and that where they had more space, and so they relocated to different rural communities. And people saw an opportunity who owned homes there and were renting them out to sell their homes. And so a lot of renters were evicted. Rental housing, although we're doing really well in building rental housing, it's a game of catch up right now. And so a lot of families were evicted. They had trouble finding new places. So we saw, I think, visibly in many different parts of British Columbia, we lost track. We were making up track on getting people inside and housing people, but I think we've seen some growth in homelessness. So encampments and homelessness keep me up. Absolutely. I really feel that we should be doing and everything we can to get people inside, and we really are. But we need to keep on doing more, and we need to keep working faster, because the challenge is growing. And when we look south of the border, down the West Coast, you can see in Seattle, you can see in California, the massive challenge of homelessness and where we're going to end up if we don't get ahead of this problem. So we've been doing some good work together on that, but it is a major challenge, and these are not minor challenges. This is the future of our economy. This is the future of the province and the livability of our cities and even villages across the province.
Yeah, you mentioned that we do have a lot underway. I mean, 3 years into the government's 10-year plan, and already 30,000 homes that are either built or underway. But as you mentioned, we're seeing increasing rates of homelessness in so many of our communities. Is the solution as simple as building more housing, or do you think that it's more complex than that?
Well, there are two pieces, at least, to this. One is supply, without question. We need to build more rental housing. We need to build more market housing. We need housing of all kinds in many parts of the province, so that's a huge factor. And the other is in a situation where demand exceeds supply, which is where we are right now. It invites speculation and the bidding up of homes as an investment class rather than as a place to live. And so government needs to stay on top of the excesses that come with a market that's in shortage until we can deal with that. So pieces like the speculation tax, there's an additional tax on vacant homes and homes that are owned by people that are not resident in British Columbia. Pieces like making sure that we actually know who the beneficial owners of properties are when they're purchased by trusts or companies, the new beneficial ownership registry that's coming on. And then also, because the market's so hot, we've seen excesses around things like money laundering. And we have a public inquiry into money laundering that in part was looking at how our housing market may have been used as a vehicle for laundering funds for organized crime. So, it's two parts. It's the supply and making sure that the demand is coming from and that we're supporting the families that and the individuals that need housing over the speculators and those who are trying to turn a quick buck.
Yeah, I'd like to build on that a bit because, you've raised some really complex interrelated issues. And as minister responsible, you're in conversations like this. You talk to industry leaders, you talk to other ministers, you talk to civil servants and academics. And then you also spend a lot of time talking to the public, talking to members of the media. What do you think the public does or does not understand about the housing crisis, given that you're navigating those two conversations?
Well, I think I need to do a better job, and I think all of us who have the information on this file need to do a better job of communicating to the public the shortage of housing and just how short we are. When you're talking about growth of different communities and people moving into communities, it doesn't even consider the fact that there are families where the kids are growing up and they want to go out and they get their own rental housing and move out of mom and dad's place, and seniors who want to leave their homes and they want to downsize and go into a condo or go into something that's easier for them to manage, and all of the housing supply that we need to manage that issue. I think that's where we're not succeeding. And it's where we have to keep working around communicating that, because I think a lot of people are concerned about house prices. I think they're concerned about homelessness. I think they're concerned when, renters are displaced or rents increase dramatically year over year. And then at the same time, I see people at city council meetings advocating against the construction of purpose-built rental housing in their communities. This happens in my community. And I think that for those of us that have this information, that know why this housing is so desperately needed. I was up in Whistler a couple of weekends ago visiting with the Whistler Housing Authority, and they're just doing amazing work up there. And they use some housing hub funding from the province and some community housing funding from the province through BC Housing as well. And they have built somewhere in the order of 6,000 units of workforce housing, because if the Whistler Resort Municipality didn't build housing for workers in that community, then the city just wouldn't work. And these are the kinds of direct and bold interventions in the housing market that we need from government, is to make sure that people have the housing they need to be successful and happy in community. And we can't just leave it to the market. So it's a challenge. I think most British Columbians are there in terms of understanding why government is taking these steps. They're supportive of the steps we've taken. But I think there's still more for us to do to share information with the public to help them understand just the depth of the shortage of housing that we face right now.
Minister, you mentioned the importance of housing for the people who power economy, housing like what's being built in Whistler right now. What is the government doing to address the shortage of housing for people with middle incomes?
Sure. And it's been dramatic. So just to give people some perspective, we got the BC Housing report for September. And year to date, this year, there's more than 11,000 purpose-built rental housing units that were registered for construction, which is almost double the years 2016, 17, and 18 combined. So what you're starting to see, and 2019 was somewhere around 13,000 is where that year finished up. So we went from an average of about 2,500 new rental units each year to now in excess of 10,000 units each year. And that reflects government's funding of purpose-built rental housing, both through the federal level, through CMHC, and through BC Housing, through the Housing Hub, where we provide lending to support the construction of purpose-built rental housing. And there's an affordability component to that as well. But the intent is to build middle-income housing and to facilitate that through lending that money. We have more than $2 billion in that program alone that's facilitating the construction of purpose-built rental housing. Then, we have all of the different programs for deeply affordable housing, whether it's our Indigenous Housing Fund, where we're, as a provincial government, for the first time, building housing on reserve in partnership with First Nations. Usually it's a federal responsibility, but the feds have let us down. They haven't been building housing on reserve the way that they should be. And so we're directly building housing on reserve, whether it's the Community Housing Fund that is helping to provide deep core housing need housing. This is for people on basic social assistance who are, when you think about folks who are in shelters or sleeping in the street, this is housing for them. So there's a wide array from the very poorest of the poor in our society to make sure that they can get inside and have a dignified home to live in, to recognizing the government needs to be involved in supporting building housing for people who work in BC. And we're starting to show some real success and traction on that. And there's also more to do, especially around working with municipalities to to get that housing approved and built as quickly as we can to respond like this is the crisis that it is.
Minister, you've talked about the importance of working with others, like as you just mentioned, talking with municipalities. And now you're well known, at least within housing circles, for talking with advocates and people with lived experience as well. Why is it important for you to speak with those whose voices have often not been heard by people in positions of power?
Yeah, thanks, Sara. This is something that I learned the hard way really early on in my career doing advocacy around housing. I was working in the downtown east side, and I'd just been hired as a lawyer by a nonprofit organization to do campaign work around housing, and in particular, to do what I could through using the law as a tool to try to improve the conditions of housing in the downtown east side, especially in the single room occupancy hotels. These are 10 by 10 rooms with shared bathrooms and kitchens. And my job was to try to make life a little better for the people who lived in those buildings. So I went into the job and I was like, okay, I know what needs to happen. There are these slumlords who are running these places. They need to be held accountable. And I'm going to use the law to do that. And we're going to shut down these slumlords. I got a call from someone who said, you know what? You're a housing lawyer. What do you think your job is? And I explained, I was going to be working to shut down the slumlords and so on. He's like, you're an idiot. I was like, excuse me. He's like, you are an idiot. Don't you understand that these are the only places where people can live who are on basic welfare in Vancouver? And if you shut down a slumlord, if you get their business license pulled and that building closes, all those people who live there are going to be homeless. How is that helping anybody? And that was a real wake up moment for me. It was, I suddenly realized that I had no idea actually what was best for my clients without talking to them, without taking instructions from them. And so that was a very early wake up call to make sure if you're trying to do something to help somebody else, you better make sure that you're talking to them first, that what you're doing isn't making things worse. And so for me, that means having regular meetings certainly with advocates who are working frontline with marginalized communities who are hearing from those communities about what's needed. Also working with regular meetings with the staff of representatives of staff of nonprofit housing to hear about what they're seeing and what they're interested in and what their priorities are. And just being available generally, I make a point of responding and reading my own correspondence. It's very important to me that I hear what people are concerned about, and so all of that is about not losing touch with the groups of people that notionally this work is supposed to support, but can only support if we are directed by those individuals. And that's especially true when you realize how disproportionately people of Indigenous heritage are represented in underhoused and homeless populations. So you have just a double call to engage and participate and understand the priorities of those communities before just moving in and thinking you're doing the right thing.
That's so important. And I know you've had many such conversations with advocates and others over the past year. Now that you're a year in, what are your priorities as minister responsible for housing over the next few years?
There are a couple. We have the Premier has directed me to complete work on a homelessness strategy. We've been very reactive as a government. An encampment will show up and we'll react with BC Housing to try to get people inside, to fund the supports to get people inside. And so there'll be a crisis and then a reaction and a crisis and a reaction. And so the Premier has asked me to go upstream to say, can we identify the feeders into homelessness? And the answer is yes, we can. We know what they are. And can we take steps to prevent people from becoming homeless in the first place? And if someone does become homeless, can we take steps to make sure that they're homeless for as brief a period as possible? Because it sounds strange potentially to your listeners, but the longer people are homeless, the longer they're going to be homeless, the more disconnected they get from family supports, from community, and the sicker they get because they're living outside and they tend to be on the streets for longer. And so shortening the length of time that people are homeless, moving upstream and preventing them from becoming homeless in the first place, that homelessness strategy is going to be really, really important for us to wrap our hands around this problem and start to make some real progress on homelessness in the province, even with the impacts of COVID. The second piece is around an initiative called Complex Care, which is to provide additional supports. There's a group of folks where they get housed, they get inside, and their behavior to their neighbors, to other people, or even just to themselves in terms of hoarding or setting fires in the room or these kinds of things, it's very scary. And so they scare themselves, they scare other people, they end up, or the rules of the supportive housing are inconsistent with what they need, and so they move out and they're back out in the street. And this group of folks are often regularly in interactions with police, firefighters, ambulance, courts, hospitals, all those frontline response services. It's wildly expensive to leave these folks out on the street and just expect all those first line responses to take care of them, compared to the program that my colleague, the Minister for Mental Health and Addiction, is launching, this Complex Care Initiative, which is more in the nature of healthcare than housing, really, responding to the medical needs, the mental health needs of these individuals so that they can be successful in housing and meet them where they're at with wraparound services. And I'm really excited about the potential of this program because this is a group that's in and out of prison. This is a group that, that a lot of things have been tried except for really high quality housing with high quality medical services attached. We do a really good job for a large number of people in the province, and BC Housing does a really good job. But this population is very clearly in need of more supports. And so those two initiatives are really critical. And then with respect to workforce housing, we'll be working closely with municipalities to get as much housing built as quickly as possible to address the shortage, so we can ease up the pressure on the low end housing and also get people a place to live. I mean, people are looking for a place to buy that they can afford. They're looking for a place to rent that they can afford. And I believe if we do it properly, bring on additional supply will help that.
Minister, you've touched on some very, very complex and challenging strategies that you have underway, whether it's a homelessness strategy, complex care, workforce housing, plus, of course, tens of thousands of homes that are being built just right now around the province. The work must be relentless. What keeps you going?
It's a combination of things. I think, first of all, I didn't set out in my career to end up in this job. I got a number of things bounced in my favor that I ended up here. It's just a remarkable opportunity, and every day feels very precious to me. So that's one thing that keeps me going, is like, wow, this opportunity is here to try to help make a difference and to support people and to do this work and to enact some of the policies that I've thought for many years as an advocate out in the community needed to be done. And so that kind of urgency, I know that politics is a time limited thing. At some point it's going to end. And so that's one piece. The other is I have a lot of support at home. I've got an incredible partner, and she is, we have a couple young kids, 7 and 2. And just that support that I have at home to be able to do this work makes it possible. And also our commitment to our kids and wanting them to have a great place to grow up and have opportunities like we had is highly motivating as well. And the last and perhaps the most important piece is the impact that this work has on people's lives. I see the news clippings when people are quoted when they move into housing for the first time from an encampment. I get letters from people. I meet people whose lives have been changed by housing, who were out on the street for a long time or who were in distress and they weren't sure where they were going to live. And then they got into some form of government supported housing, and their lives are transformed. And it's so inspiring and moving. And it's very rare that I read these stories and I'm not, that I don't feel my eyes welling up just with just the emotion and the relief that people have when they're finally housed and they feel safe, and how huge that is for people. So that's really, at the end of the day, I've got a good foundation at home. I've got this remarkable opportunity the Premier has given me in this position, my colleagues, the support of my colleagues and the government. And then just knowing the impact that this has on people's lives, and really how that drives home for me is how important this work is.
What an inspiring note for us to end on today. I'd like to thank the Attorney General and Minister responsible for housing, David Eby, for joining us on Let's Talk Housing. We've had a fantastic conversation. Let's talk again soon.